if everything goes well. We are. And so I'll just let people know we're live now. I'm with Roger Nelson. It's still a little early for people who are viewing this video archival. You could fast forward about 4 minutes. We're live early right now to make sure that everything is working, and that at 3 o'clock Mountain Time, when we officially begin, everything will be functioning smoothly. And right now, we're just waiting. But we can say hi. There are a few people already actually who jumped on right away, Roger. More people. The YouTube announcement to our 88,000 subscribers doesn't go out until we actually go live, apparently.
Really?
Huh. Yeah, I've been trying to find a way to, we notify people. We have a newsletter that reaches many people also. But what we'll find is that.
So maybe we have just friends who were notified by somebody like me.
Yeah. Well, sure, they'll be the early birds, but by the time we're done, we'll have had over 1,000 people.
Cool.
Most people, it seems, will stay on for about 15 or 20 minutes. That seems to be the average attention span.
Uh-huh. Well, they're outdoing some of us. Yeah. Actually, my attention span isn't so bad. It's the ability to get anything out of the attention I give. Actually, and we're still okay.
Yeah.
You apparently have a completely different kind of display of what's happening than I. You see numbers of people.
I do. I have access to the, you could call it the back door.
It's a couple of minutes early. I like to get the live stream started a few minutes early just to make sure that we're not running into any technical.
There, I got rid of that.
That was a replay of a couple minutes ago.
Yeah, because there's a delay.
Yeah,
actually, but we've got 2 minutes to go. We'll officially start. I think we should have a brief conversation, and I already see many questions are coming in. We have a group of about 5 moderators who are going through the chat window on YouTube, which flies by so fast I can't even follow it at times, but they'll pick out the best questions and send them to me on a separate document. And
oh, great. Yeah, that sounds like a really good plan. It's hard to keep up with, I guess it's the speed of electrons.
We're very fortunate. We've got Jim, Elizabeth, Dan, Ali, Emmy, and Laura all moderating today.
So they all look at the stream of questions and pick out some good ones.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and then after we're done, we'll go for 90 minutes. And then afterwards, it would be nice. I'll invite those moderators to come on Zoom with us to say hello.
Cool, yeah.
So, okay, it is now officially 3 o'clock USA Mountain Time. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I am with Dr. Roger Nelson, who is the author of Connected, a book about his global consciousness project. Roger, you were just telling me that you've been, in effect, reviving the global consciousness project after 5 years of relative quiescence.
And that's true. The size of the network is now smaller than it was while we were doing the formal experiments. And I'm, contacting people who have contributed before and asking if they are interested in cranking it up again. And quite a few people are. So we have about a little over 24 people now doing that.
So I know some of our viewers won't have watched our previous interview, won't have read the book or viewed your website. So maybe for the benefit of those people who are completely ignorant about the Global Consciousness Project, can we briefly describe it?
I think you said people who are completely innocent of knowledge of the Global Consciousness Project. But I know you said something much wiser than that. What it is a kind of experiment, formal for 17 years, where the question asked in the experiment was, can we detect any indications, any signs whatsoever of what some people would term a global consciousness? The idea is that some is actually derived from thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin, who talked about a layer of intelligence for the Earth, a kind of noosphere, he called it, where human beings ultimately are destined to become a part of such a layer of intelligence and become stewards of the Earth rather than dominators, as we seem to be these days. So using technology that was developed in the laboratory for asking people to try to change a physical system, and the one we used in a lot of the experiments is called a random number generator. We asked people to try to change the behavior of a random number generator just by wishing for it to change, by thinking it should produce higher numbers or lower numbers. And those experiments indicated that people can indeed, just by thought or intention, communicate with a physical system of this particular kind, one whose future is unpredictable and undetermined. That led us to, or allowed us to think about broader questions. For example, in the laboratory, we'd have just one person trying to work his will or her will on the random number generator. And we wondered what would happen if you had 2 people or a dozen people. And that led ultimately to taking the experiment out of the lab into the field, taking a random number generator with appropriate software to, for example, a great concert or the opera, or a ritual in a church, or maybe a ritual in the woods with the pagans celebrating the full moon or whatever. Lots of different environments where the expectation was that people would come together as a group and become coherent with each other and create a kind of group consciousness. So we asked, is that group consciousness capable, just as an individual consciousness was, of changing the behavior of this random number generator? And there's a progression. This leads to more questions. What if we had multiple random number generators in one of these group consciousness conducive situations? What if the random number generators weren't there, but elsewhere? And what if we had a whole lot of them spread around the world? Might we be able to look in on a much grander conception of consciousness or group consciousness, the whole world coming together in some way, driven perhaps by circumstances or perhaps by their own internal intentions, to become a kind of coherent group. I'll give more examples if people are interested in that as we go along. But maybe that's a sufficient introduction of the structure of the experiment.
I think it's important probably to let people know that the random number generators themselves are based on quantum mechanical principles, quantum tunneling in effect.
That's right. They're the best random number generators we know how to build. They use, as you say, quantum tunneling of electrons through what amounts to a switch that's closed against them. There's a little leakage through a barrier because of this quantum process called tunneling. And that leakage is completely unpredictable, but it produces on the other side of the barrier a tiny voltage, which we can sample and then ask whether the sample is a relatively high voltage or low voltage, and convert that, as you might guess, into ones and zeros. That's the language of a random number generator. So we have used a number of different kinds, but they're all physical, and they're all based on quantum principles, and they all produce when there's no influence of consciousness, they produce truly random numbers. They pass all the tests wonderfully.
And in summary, what you found is over 500 different events, things, often large-scale events like the funeral of Princess Diana or the 9/11 attacks, that these random event generators spread all over the planet showed unusual perturbations.
That's right. The protocol for analysis, it asks basically whether during 1 second of time, when perhaps 60 or 70 of these devices have sent their data, is there any correlation between these devices? And the answer is yes, a very small correlation, but predictably in circumstances where very large numbers of people are brought together and engaged and become coherent in a sense because of the events in the world. They're not all negative, by the way. We looked at New Year's every year and found in one of the measures that we take that there is a period of something like 10 minutes or so around midnight that that looks rather different. The data might be wandering at a kind of random level and then begin to drop down a little before midnight, a few minutes, and reach the lowest point right about midnight, and then come back up and then go on being random. So in other words, we had a pattern that looked like a V shape with midnight right in the middle. Very interesting.
But midnight is different at different locations. So were these localized random event generators?
Well, what we do is do what's called epoch averaging, or down through averaging. If you take the first time zone, which might be where New Zealand is or Australia, and add the next one on top of it, and the next on top of that, you have a stack of, turns out, not just 24, but something like 35 time zones. We add them, we stack them all up and make an average down through them. And that gives a picture of midnight wherever it is. That's a kind of average through all the time zones. So that's the procedure for dealing with the real world of complications in time zones.
Taco Bell has a question for you, Roger. He asks, how many machines do you still have running, and do you plan to add more?
Good question. We have about somewhere between 25 and 30 now running. There's always some maintenance to do and protocols to get through to get data from maybe Fiji to Princeton. So I'm encouraging people who have participated in the past to crank up their machines again and participate. But beyond that, I'm working with a number of people through the IONS group and the HeartMath group on building what's called GCP 2.0. In other words, a kind of new version of the GCP network that will probably have, we want at least 1,000 nodes around the world. And for the purpose, we're building customized random sources that will be more complicated. They'll do more measures than the old ones, but they'll be easier to install and maintain. So we're looking forward to that. It will be several months, though, maybe as much as a year before we have that GCP 2.0 running. And in the meantime, there are all kinds of interesting events going on in the world. And I couldn't not look at things like the elections and the COVID crisis and so forth.
Now, for viewers who may not know, you mentioned GCP, that's Global Consciousness Project. And you
Thank
also
you,
mentioned
Jeffrey.
IONS, which is the Institute of Noetic Sciences that you're working with. We have another question from the Big Cat, who asks, is the full data set available?
Yes, the full data set is available on my website, or the Global Consciousness Project website, which is global-mind.org. That's the easiest and quickest way to get there. What you'll want is the results. There's a good menu. It's a menu with several columns, and there's one labeled data. And one of the first entries in that column is results. So you can go to that results.html page and find a huge table with all the results. But you can also find things like the registry, the hypothesis registry. All of the events that we ever looked at in the formal series had an a priori prediction that was specified before any data were examined. And that hypothesis registry is there for people to examine. And there's also a bunch of exploratory things, which that's another category altogether of things that we didn't consider to be necessarily good for the formal hypothesis test, but interesting perhaps. For example, when my mother died a long time ago, the network was running, and I decided I would look at the data during that time because it was interesting to me, but not the sort of thing that belonged in the formal database.
Well, since you bring up a personal experience, Andrea Williams says Peter Bansal wrote an article recently attributing the results to a experimenter effect, a worldwide experimenter effect. Do you agree? How do you evaluate the possibility of an experimenter effect clouding your data?
Well, I actually don't. I think the experiment has to be there, obviously. Otherwise, you don't have an experiment. And so the experimenter's ideas and influences are a little bit like the problem in quantum mechanics, where you find out the answer to the question you ask. Depends somewhat on the nature of the question. To answer the question rather directly, I think Peter's emphasis is wrong. He's not wrong in principle, because the experimenter does contribute in some measure. I have to decide whether the event is going to be in the list or not. And the reason there are several reasons I'm pretty sure that Peter's emphasis is wrong. One of them is really quite simply kind of mechanical in a way. We do the same event year after year in some cases. For example, I mentioned New Year's earlier. We always use the same protocol for that. So it doesn't matter that I decide to do it, or that we choose a particular starting time or anything like that. The same with events like September 21st has various names and celebrations. It's called Earth Day, and people all over the world celebrate it. We look at that every year, and we look at it the same way every time. There's an event in India called the Kumbh Mela. That's something that if I only picked it once, you might say, my choice of timing is determinate. And that's the reason we get results. But we look at it the same way year after year, or time after time. There's other kinds of things too, like, for example, if we use the technology of brain research, looking at what are called evoked potentials, there is a very characteristic curve that is found. If you flash a light in someone's eye or make a loud sound, the brain will make a sort of a little flash of activity. but the brain is very complicated, and those flashes of activity aren't very neat and readable unless you do it a lot of times. If you repeat it many times and average all those times, you can get a curve that looks, I'll draw this in the air, but maybe you can get the idea. It drops a little bit, goes up to a peak, and then drops down again, then comes back to normal. If we look at the event data in the Global Consciousness Project, it has the same form. It's a remarkably complex thing for an experimenter effect to produce.
And you seem to be suggesting then that what you're measuring with all of these random event generators is something equivalent to a global brain.
Well, it's called the Global Consciousness Project by accident. It fits very nicely in that metaphor. I mean, I was a little surprised when Peter started talking about and producing analyses that showed a certain characteristic that he thought, man, it must be an experimenter effect. It caused me a lot of head scratching, and I looked at those figures that he had produced, and I thought about them while I was in these hypnagogic state, when you're about to go to sleep. And at one point it said, oh my gosh, I recognize that. That looks like the kind of thing I saw when I was a graduate student looking at brain physiology. That looks like an evoked response, only the form is different. So there are many different ways to process the data. I deconvolved what Peter had done and got back the raw data, and then did the brain evoked response analysis on that, came up with curves that look just like what happens if you flash a light in somebody's eye. So it's a little strong to say global brain, but it's the data are consistent with the idea that there is a kind of coherent global process that produces this change in the behavior of our instruments. I don't want to be flippant about it at all, but I really think that we have collected evidence that is, at the very least, consistent with and supportive of the notion that we are looking at the very beginnings, the kind of nascent or embryonic global consciousness. And by the way, I think we're looking at it at the beginning of its growth into, or I hope maturation into, a functional global consciousness. If we had that, we'd be able to deal with a lot of things that we are now failing to even recognize as problems.
A couple of people are asking questions about how can they get involved if people want to participate in some way in your project. What opportunities exist?
Wow, it's a little difficult to provide something now, but I hope something on the order of 6 months to a year, we'll have GCP 2.0 cranking up, and people who want to be involved can probably participate in that. It might not be as exciting as one might imagine, because basically you'll have a computer that's sitting someplace or a router with a device plugged into it. But we need people for that, and you please feel welcome to send me an email note. I have a file of people who want to participate and want to contribute. And you can send it to rdnelson, RDNELSON, at princeton.edu, princeton.edu.
Okay, thank you for that, Roger. And you mentioned earlier that if we had more of a global consciousness, we might be able to address problems that we don't even recognize. Emmy Vadnais, who's one of our volunteers, has asked, what are the application from the trends in the data that could be applied by people to benefit individuals and society?
Yes, that's a really nice question. It's one I think about, and I have a kind of answer for it. but it's not so direct as we might like. What I think the global consciousness data and analyses provide is a kind of basement for a structure that is basically made of implications. So what is the implication of the fact that devices separated by thousands of miles and designed to be random in the first place start correlating with each other? What can that possibly imply? And the second part of that question or equation is, when do they do that? They do that when human beings have come together in a very, very clear kind of coherent state of mind, or I think it's even more important, state of emotion. When a whole large number of people share an emotion like compassion or love, there is, in my mind, and based on looking at the data, no question but what they have created. They do create something like a field of consciousness that is now a real thing in the world. So the implication is that we are capable of creating a connection with each other. The book that Jeff mentioned, Connected, which is subtitled The Emergence of Global Consciousness, is really about the evidence that we are connected at some level that's beneath our conscious ability to perceive, but very real. It has an expressed reality in the data from from an experiment like the GCP. And it's sort of, I think, reasonably easy to see that this connected consciousness, even though we're not aware of it, could become more conscious. We could bring up into our conscious awareness by intention and by design the kinds of connections that are shown in the data, but not in our acts up to now. I think we're getting there. I get a lot of incoming mail from people who are saying, we're putting together this great gathering of people for this purpose. And then this weekend, this past couple of days, there were at least 4 of these major events, which don't necessarily know about each other, but I get information from them all. They're heartening. They really make me think that that more and more people are beginning to come together to try to do whatever we can imagine to make this world a brighter place, a place with a future.
Here's a very related question from Farshad. He's asking about social networks. He says they connect huge chunks of the population, like TikTok, but he thinks perhaps they only promote very shallow, superficial types of connection and instead of real values. I wonder what you think about social networks and how they're impacting the idea of global consciousness.
Yeah. I think social networks are at the beginning of their growth as functional elements in in what determines the future. And I didn't learn the name, but I encourage anybody with that kind of question in mind to think and talk with your friends and work together in your social networks to shape the future of those networks toward making the world better for all of us. That's a little bit, idealistic sounding, but it's not unrealistic. Margaret Mead, I'm pretty sure it was she who first said, there is, we should realize that the acts of a single individual can change the world. She said, that's the only thing that ever has. So I encourage anybody who has this feeling to put your thinking cap on and join a bunch of other people and just start building social networks that actually are not shallow and which do have some bearing on a future that we all would like to be a little brighter.
Here's an interesting question from Joe Bananas 37, who asks, people on YouTube don't need to use their real names. They use pseudonyms all the time.
Hey,
So
Joe Bananas 37.
Joe Bananas 37 asks, what about effects that are localized in the vicinity of the RNGs? Are they all global, or do you find local effects as well?
A good question, Joe Bananas 37. The truth is, the analysis of the Global Consciousness Project data has always been global. We are not, that system just isn't set up to do local experiments, even though we occasionally do an analysis for example, a meditation that really only Californians know about, or Europeans. And but that's an exception, and it's not generally a part of the formal project. What I suggest when people want to do that is what we call field REG, field RNG, the kind of interim stage between the laboratory where one person was at work and the group consciousness experiments where people were all at a big concert, or maybe touring the ancient religious sites in Egypt or whatever. Some group, in other words. So that protocol requires only, and uses generally speaking, only one random number generator, and has an analysis that is sort of shaped for the purpose. I can recommend that you look up field REG, FIELD REG on the web, and you'll find a couple of experiments. Several papers about that kind of thing.
Because it is the case that people have been doing research with these random event generators, I think since the days Russell Targ and Helmut Schmidt back in the 1970s.
Right, they have been, and I'm not sure whether I don't think there were many, if any, field or group consciousness experiments until like early 1990s, which is when I started doing that. And at about the same time, several other people, Dean Radin, Dick Bierman, a few others, started doing that same kind of experiment. They were all focused on the group, on a consciousness that a form of consciousness produced by group activity and a group coherence. So it's not a new paradigm, but it's one that I think still is quite valid and viable. There are quite a few people write to me and who want to do that. The hitch is that there isn't any currently. There isn't any random number generator plus software that's available for people to just download or buy. And I've encouraged a couple of people who do that kind of work to go ahead and produce that, because it's a really interesting kind of experiment. I mean, people, I'll just get on a little bit different soapbox for a moment. A lot of people would like to know if their meditation is doing any good. And when they write to me and say, how can I get a field reg measurement of this meditation and see if it's doing any good? My response is always along the lines of saying, the best measurement instrument you have is right here in your chest. And your own perceptions of whether people have come together and merged and produced something new. So you don't need the technology necessarily, but it's a nice supplement to the feelings and understandings that we have from direct experience.
Well, since you bring up meditation, we have a question from Don Key, who says, hi, I've been meditating for a long time. I'm pretty sure my neighbors up to 50 feet can hear or sense my thoughts, and I can sense theirs. This is really annoying. What should I do?
Stop thinking. No, I'm sorry. That's a little flippant. If it's not causing trouble, I wouldn't worry about it at all. You might really consider getting some kind of objective data to document the phenomenon you're speaking about. It's definitely a little bit unusual in my experience that people 50 feet away will hear my thoughts or detect my meditations, unless they are also in a meditative state, at which point there's really interesting kinds of work done, for example, by the HeartMath Institute, showing that our hearts produce pretty big electromagnetic fields, which can be detected several feet away from the body with minimal instrumentation, and 20 or 50 feet away if you have really sensitive stuff going on.
You're talking about things like the heartbeat, I assume.
Right, heartbeat, but the heart rate, the heart produces this field of activity that's influenced by the beating of the heart and by the rhythms of the heart. In other words, it produces a modulated field that reflects things like the measure that the HeartMath people have developed, which is really very powerful, it's called heart rate variability. It's something that's very much influenced by state of mind and things like your mood or the activity in your mind. For example, aggression, feeling anger, and those kinds of things produce a very erratic picture of heart rate variability, whereas something like appreciation, gratitude, and probably most forms of meditation will produce a smooth kind of heart rate variability measure, which is consonant with and indicative of good health in both physical and mental terms.
Here's a question from Daniel, who asks, do you think that sufficient coherence could resolve the world into a single point of consciousness? And let me add, would that be a good thing?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't really know, but I do think that it would be possible. It's just not something that's very likely, because we do have just a tremendously complex world with, I talk about my network being influenced by millions of people. Well, we have billions of people. Some of them are in dire straits and very unhappy and under threat and so forth. And they're not the kind of people you expect to come into coherence with somebody sitting in, an apartment in New York City and listening to nice music. That it's just so. To answer the question, I think that would be a goal to aim for, but not to expect right away or very soon. It's the sort of thing that's an evolutionary target. Teilhard de Chardin, who is kind of inspirational figure in my personal experience, wrote beautifully about what one book was called The Phenomenon of Man. In that, he talks about evolution, starting from the bare particles, going through little more and more complicated gatherings of elements into molecules, and then living molecules, and ultimately into something like us, with a self-aware consciousness. That's an evolutionary process, which Teilhard said is very remarkable. But he said, we aren't finished yet, even though we look like we think we are perhaps the pinnacle of evolution. There's more to go, and where to go is toward what he called noosphere, a kind of gathering of all of our human capacity into a global capacity and global consciousness, if you will. That's not terms he used, but he said that our destiny is to evolve to the next stage, which would be to be an intelligence for the earth. And he was a practical man, a scientist as well as a theologian. And he said, I think he said this someplace, I have the idea that he said, don't get in too much of a hurry. It may be 10,000 years. But I think we're on the way. We just have taken only baby steps yet.
Here's a related question. Julia Wild says, my husband and I have shared the same telepathic dreams. If two can do this, perhaps all will be able to do so ultimately. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. It sounds, first of all, we know that you folks are not the only ones who've ever experienced that. Other people have, and there are people in the lucid dreaming community who talk about groups gathering together in the lucid state. And I think it isn't exactly sky's the limit, but I think there is there's room for growth in this area, and that, the next step after the two commune so clearly in shared dreams, for larger groups to do that. And again, it may be 10,000 years, but I think we're evolving in that direction. I think Teilhard was right. We are an unfinished project, and it's not unreasonable to think that way. I mean, it's great hubris to think that we are, the be all and end all. We have two possible futures. One of them is to destroy ourselves, and the other is to reach for the stars.
Here's a question from John Alexander. I assume it's my friend John Alexander, who's been a guest on New Thinking Aloud, and who you probably also know, Roger. He asks, is there any difference in intensity or in any of the other characteristics of the signal between events that can be considered positive versus negative?
Hi, John. Yes, that's a question that we asked formally. And it turns out that the term I use for that is valence. We have positive valence and negative valence events, and they don't differ in amplitude or magnitude of effect. There's a very small difference, but it's not the sort of thing that would be significant or might consider to be real. And along the same lines, though, we have looked at a variety of different kinds of emotions to ask, is any of them more potent? And it turns out that there are some which are really very, very powerful. And the one that I like talking about most, and which happens to produce the largest effect of all, is compassion. And compassion, as anybody who thinks about it can recognize, is a connecting emotion anyway. If you have compassion, it's almost certain that you are, although we can talk about self-compassion, really it's almost always about people out in the world, other people. And so compassion and love and those kinds of joining emotions are the ones that seem to be most powerful, in the sense that they're most reliable. If I select an event that is going to evoke a lot of compassion, I can bet a little heavier that it will produce a positive effect.
I think this is something of a related question from Neil Picard, who asked, to become aware of the collective unconscious requires one to turn off the grasping, egocentric mind. That is challenging in the social structure currently in place. How can we change this?
Meditate, meditate, meditate. I can only be flippant about it. It's a terribly important question, and one that I ask myself. and I pose experimentally in a way, but we don't have a very good answer. I think we're developing it, though. I mentioned earlier that there are lots of groups, and there are individuals too, but what's most promising is that there are many, many groups that are bringing people together, often specifically using something like meditation, which, if it's practiced by an individual, does eventually calm down most of the interference. And when a lot of individuals who have practiced practice together, and by the way, practicing together is a way to amplify, or at least make more powerful, the effects of meditation. It seems we find it easier if we are not alone and during our meditations. So the answer, I don't have a real answer, but the way to go is, I think, to look for opportunities, to look for friends and relatives and contacts of various kinds who will join with you, with us, with all of us who are interested in this, and trying to make to try to envision a better future. And I use that word, envision, very, very purposefully. What we envision is vastly more likely to come into existence than if we didn't ever think of it.
Here's a question from Lost Self, who actually the question presumes something. So Lost Self says, why do emotions influence random number generators the most? And also, is that the case, that emotions have a stronger influence than, let's just say, cognitive events or cognitive instructions?
Good question. I'm not a theoretician, but I do think about, how does it work? And the answers, virtually every time I think about it, and every time I read more from various people about it, I come around to the notion of a consciousness field, or an information field. And I believe that we construct a field of information when we are coherent, and when we share this state of coherence in a group with other people, then that group creates a field of information, or consciousness field. And I'll then go one step further to say that I believe that what a random number generator does in the presence of a structured field of information is possibly to absorb some of that information and change change a sample that would have been a 1 into a 0, or vice versa. That is to say, a random sequence produced by one of these devices, or a whole network of these devices, completely unpredictable from one second to the next, or from one trial to the next, one sample to the next. And that means that its future is undetermined. And what I believe is that the determination of the future of an information device, like a random sequence, is the future is indeterminate until there is an input from an information source. I can go one step further for those people who are interested in physics. David Bohm is probably a pretty well-known name. In consciousness research, he's, I think, taking over more and more of a place that he, I think, rightfully should have. He talks about an implicate, this may be getting too long and too deep, well, but I'll just finish it quickly.
No, go ahead, Roger. It sounds interesting.
David Bohm envisioned an implicate order. That is, a kind of completely inaccessible order in the universe, out of which real things, real particles, and real objects and real people ultimately could come. guided by information waves, pilot waves, which he also referred to as active information. Basically, the active information is something that's virtual until it's needed, and then when it's like a lock and key. If there's a need for the information, the two merge. There's the information that's needed merges with the structure where it is needed. So I think that the way these random number generator devices change in the presence of a strong emotion or very strong intention is by accepting some information, structuring information that comes from the mind of one or many people. So I think that, in other words, we create what amounts to something like an active information field by having emotions and by having thoughts, and that active information field may manifest in something like a random number generator or in the healing of a person far away, because there's where the information is needed.
Here's another related question from Joe Bananas 37, once again, who asks, can you talk about the effect that was noted several hours before the unfolding of the events of 9/11?
Yes. We never have had a formal protocol to study precursors or precursor events or premonitions in the Global Consciousness Project, but because the data are all there, it's a stream of data which are present. When a really big event comes along, like 9/11, our inclination is to study it, to try to find out more about it. So what we did was, I think there were 4 or 5 of us, all with analytical skills, looking from various perspectives at the data from 9/11. And we very quickly discovered that the formal prediction, which started just before the first plane hit and extended 4 hours to the future, didn't cover the activity very well at all. The big change and I think indisputable change in the data started probably close to a day before that first plane hit, became very strong about 4 or 5 hours before the first plane hit, and then continued for 2 more days after that. So in other words, we had a data aberration that covered not only the event itself, but a period of time before and after. I might not take too much, I might not pay such strong attention to the apparent premonition on the part of a global consciousness, or maybe it was something else. But Peter Bancel, who we talked about before, did some analysis of earthquakes, big earthquakes. He did this some time ago, I think 2006 or 7, but he had at the time 600 earthquakes of Richter magnitude 6 and greater. That's the size earthquake that damages cities, knocks down buildings, and often results in death. And 500 of those were in the oceans. Only 100 of the 600 were on land. The ones on land, and some of the analyses Peter did, showed very unmistakable patterns of behavior, whereas the ones in the oceans did not. The unmistakable pattern of behavior that was particularly noticeable in the sort of the ring of fire that includes South America and North America was a pattern that started, if you look at a couple of days or a day of data, about 8 hours before the primary temblor, the big sharp crash, the data started going down and it bottomed out. This is like our New Year's data, and then came back up afterwards to the normal level. This was, Peter says, an exploratory analysis, and he thinks we shouldn't put too much stock in it. But that plus a few other incidents like the tsunami in the Indian Ocean showed a pretty remarkable spike about 24 hours ahead. I'm not scientifically convinced, but the evidence points in the direction of at least being of this being a good question.
And now that we're getting in a little more into some of the technical aspects, there's a question from the Big Cat who says, what about false positives? How do you account for non-random positive result between the random event generators? In other words, if you conduct 100 tests, do you expect statistically a certain number of false positives?
Yes, that's true of any kind of statistical analysis. You will, basically we ask a question about probability. What's the probability that this deviation occurred by chance? And the criterion most people use is 5%. If it occurs by chance only 5% of the time, that means 5% of the results that you have at that level will be what you're calling false positives. Whether they are, whether that's the right name for them is maybe up for grabs. But at the very least, we don't think that every wiggle in the curve is necessarily meaningful or necessarily means that we have a significant outcome.
Here's an interesting question from Marta Lyle, who says, it has been noted that there have been historically huge spikes in the Schumann resonances in the last 24 hours. So let's talk about the Schumann resonance and what it is and how it might have, whether or not it does, or how it might have any relationship at all to the measurements you're making in the Global Consciousness Project.
This is a question that the people at HeartMath would be even better able. We're collaborators, and they use my data. I look at theirs. They're experts in things like Schumann resonance. What the Schumann resonance amounts to is a wave of electromagnetics bouncing from the ionosphere back to Earth and going around the Earth, and lots of people think that big changes in magnitude are actually spikes in frequency, and that's a mistake. What people are usually talking about, and this, I don't know what happened in the last 24 hours, but the frequencies simply do not change in a big way. There's the primary Schumann resonance frequency is, I think, 7.8 hertz. And you can take multiples and half multiples of that and go up the scale. It's an interesting spectrum, and it probably does have some relationship to the way human beings are. We're affected by electromagnetics. We are electromagnetic in nature. And so things like the Schumann frequencies may change our behavior a little bit. Things like, and Schumann resonance is affected by this. When the sun has big storms, sunspots, it sends out at high speed a tremendous amount of energy. And that affects the Earth in what you can easily think of as solar weather or geomagnetic weather. And the Schumann resonance interacts with this geomagnetic weather. We know that from experiments that geomagnetic fluctuations change the way people behave or perform in psi experiments. So if the geomagnetic weather is calm, people do better. They perform, they get higher scores in psi tests than if the geomagnetic weather is stormy. And that could also somehow interact with Schumann resonance. But I'm not an expert in the area. Go to the HeartMath website and check it out there.
We're going to get some questions that, of course, are not directly related to your specific research, and some interesting ones. Here's one from Orphan Red, who asks if you can discuss results that were presented at the SSE's 2019 conference. That's the Society for Scientific Exploration. I know you're a participant there. And he's talking about a study that showed turbulence on an airplane would cause the random number generator to start generating non-random strings.
I don't know that study. It may have been presented there, but it wasn't my work, and I don't remember seeing it. But I can tell you that the random number generators that we use in formal experiments are pretty much immune to influences from electromagnetic fields, from changes in temperature, or for that matter, turbulent airflow, as far as I can tell. I mean, if you hit the thing with a hammer, it might change its behavior, but if you just wave an electromagnetic wand at a random number generator that's well designed, it's probably not going to cause any trouble or changes.
I assumed that maybe what he was referring to is the emotions of the people on the airplane when there's turbulence.
Oh, I missed that entirely. Thank you, Jeff. I never have done any experiment where very strong fear emotions were induced, and I don't plan to ever. But there's no reason to doubt that it could be done. I mean, if you happened to be running a field REG kind of data stream and in an airplane where a lot of people suddenly became fearful, I think it would make sense to predict a little uptick in the data stream.
So this is a change of pace kind of question. I know you talked about David Bohm's implicate order, and I suspect that maybe this question actually relates to that, although it'd be interesting to know your response. It's from Jessica Pacheco, who asks, who are the voices that speak to us? And she adds that she had a bad accident and a voice saved her from being run over by a semi-truck.
Wow, yeah. Well, Jessica, I don't know who the voices are. My first speculative shot at it is that the voice is your own. The voices are our own. That our minds, I think the experiments show this so very clearly, are not confined inside our skull, and they aren't even confined to this moment. We have precognitive dreams, we have shared dreams, we have experiments where people can be 1,000 miles away from a device in a laboratory and send their intentions, however they feel like doing that, and change the behavior of the instrument in the laboratory 1,000 miles away. So the point I want to make is that your consciousness is way bigger than the skull encased or the body embodied version that probably comes most easily to mind. Most of us think, my mind, it's in there. It's not, it's everywhere.
A beautiful answer, Roger. Emmy Vadnais, who is one of our volunteers, asks, what has surprised you the most as you have collected the data?
I actually have thought about that question enough to have a pat answer. It is that the data continue to tell us the same story. The literature of parapsychology in particular is, and this is true also in straight psychology and even in physics. things change. And in parapsychology, there's a decline effect. But in this global consciousness project experiment, there is no decline effect. We have some ups and downs and so forth over the 17 years of formal experimentation. But basically, the trend has been pretty steady and has produced if you put it all together, produce a 1 trillion to 1 odds kind of outcome. That means, 1,000 billion times you could run an experiment of this same size, and you would get that result only once.
It's really quite amazing when you consider the difficulty other lines of parapsychology research have had in terms of consistency. Here's a question from Arthur, who's asking you a little bit about your own personal experiences, Roger. He says, is it possible that the phenomena of astral traveling is something like visiting the collective consciousness of humanity? And have you had experience with it?
I guess yes and maybe. I think there's we put our thoughts as best we can into words, try to communicate pretty complicated notions to other people. So we use astral travel to mean something that probably is different for each of us. But I'm fairly sure that not only are we not alone in the universe, we are way bigger and more, how shall I say, more present in the universe than we actually imagine. I think that, for example, we know in principle from physics, from good solid quantum physics, that there is something of a phenomenon called entanglement that connects, that actually takes items, elements that have been connected, have been part of each other, have been together, and if you separate them, they remain entangled. They remain connected, even if it's the separation is global or even cosmic distances. So I think that's the universe that we participate in, and I think that we are maybe. Let me take a slightly different tack on it, because there are people who talk about consciousness as being the fundamental out of which the universe arises. Now, I'm not for a second convinced that that's the same consciousness I am talking about when I say global consciousness or my consciousness or whatever, but there's something like consciousness. There's some entity that is something we might aspire to understand better. We may never understand it fully because it's so much bigger than we are. It's like looking at the universe, we're looking at something like consciousness. So that's wandering a little bit far afield, but I think that the point I want to make is that we're not isolated little bits of protoplasm. We're part of a universe.
Well, speaking of the universe, Roger, there have been a number of questions, and I haven't quite figured out how to address them, but they have to do with UFOs and abductions. And people are curious if the Global Consciousness Project has any relationship to these kinds of phenomena. One questioner even mentioned some event that took place with the SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, some event that was tracked at Arecibo. Are any of those in your database?
I don't think so. Once in a while we do something that is it's a little different from an ordinary human scale event. But I don't think, it's hard for us to figure out the a priori question that we're asking. What is the hypothesis? So if we don't know anything about the UFO, we can't really ask a very good formal question. I hope that's an adequate answer, but the truth is, I don't think we know how to ask that kind of question very well of this data. Jeff, I need to excuse myself for just a moment.
Sure, go right ahead. And let me just mention that it is 6 minutes after 4 here in the Mountain Time Zone. And our plan is to continue up until 1:30. So we've got another 24 minutes or so. I know there are a lot of questions that are kind of unrelated to Roger's work. And while he's taking a little break, I might endeavor to go through some of them. Or let me do this instead. Roger suggested for people who are interested in participating in the project that the opportunities in the future, maybe months to a year from now, when they get the Global Consciousness Project 0.0 launched. And he's suggesting for people who are interested in getting involved, I think one of the best ways to get involved is actually host what he calls an egg, a event generator. And I'm giving out your once, it's rdnelson@princeton.edu for people who are interested in participating in your research. And I was just suggesting also, Roger, that if people do want to participate, one good way might be for them to host one of the random event generators.
Right, but I'm not growing the current network other than people that have already been in it. Maybe it's too strongly put, but it's a bit of an undertaking. And I'm long retired, and I started, talking to people about GCP 2.0, so that the project could have a kind of follow on, and in which people who are interested can participate. So if people do send me a note, I can put them on the list of people who will be, you might say, first in line. Actually, second in line. There are a lot of people who already want to, but we're hoping to, build a network of at least 1,000. Could be way bigger than that. We don't know yet.
But I presume at this point it would be managed by other organizations. You mentioned IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I think you mentioned HeartMath.
Right. The person who's basically in charge of this new venture is Roland McCready, whom you know, I'm sure. And if you don't, you should. He's the director of research at HeartMath Institute. And he and his team have been running a small but very interesting network of electromagnetic detectors placed around the world. At each of those sites, we also have one of our eggs. Anyway, Roland is spearheading the development of the new, the new network.
2.0.
2.0, yeah. Oh, by the way, I should say, I have a kind of to-do list, which used to be, it's still on my website, but I have recently been updating it to things that would really be valuable. But all of those things, which require certain kinds of computer skills and programming and so forth, almost all of them. So they're, as anybody who ever does research knows, all answers reveal more questions than they actually answer. So, and that we have a 20-year database of that is always publicly accessible. Lots of people download that or download pieces of it and do some analysis. But if people want to contribute to the project and have skills of scripting and programming and analysis, there are some lovely little projects that they could help with.
Good. I hope you get some volunteers. And again, they can reach you at rdnelson@princeton.edu. Here's an interesting question from Arthur, who says, what is the physical basis of the mind, not the brain? And do you subscribe to the theory of Roger Penrose?
I mentioned before that I'm not really a theorist. I know the theory of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff reasonably well, and I can't say that I subscribe to it or that I would reject it either. The physical basis of the mind, that might be what is it called? An oxymoron. That I'm not entirely sure there is a physical basis to the mind. Clearly, there is a linkage of mind and matter in the form of the brain, but I think the evidence is just overwhelming that the mind is not simply the activity of neurons sending their packets of neurotransmitters across junctions and connecting to each other. It's an amazing instrument, the brain, but it isn't all. It isn't as far as I can see, and I don't know anybody who can see that adequately deals with the question of what a mind is.
And here's a question related to your interest in the work of Teilhard de Chardin. Daniel asks, if thinking forward in time is inherently uncertain, shouldn't the evolutionary future that you and Teilhard describe emerge from, and he puts this in quotes, thinking into the present?
I think yes, maybe. I'm not entirely sure I understand all the implications in that question, but I'm very strongly convinced, because of a personal experience and a lot of laboratory and other experimental work, that what we wish for and what we envision is becomes a little bit more likely to happen in the world simply because of our wish and intention. Now, this is, I think, supported by the experience of the whole human race, which has been doing something like, envisioning, praying for all of its existence. I think as soon as we could think, certainly as soon as we could talk, one of the first things we might say is, oh, please let it happen this way, to let the rain come, let the crops be healthy, and so on. This is human beings are practical at least much of the time in such a way that they would not continue to do something stupid and pointless, or I should say pointless and stupid. So these things that we do over millennia, I think, should be respected as a kind of model for what's possible.
And here's a question from Kyla. Earlier, Roger, you when people asked you what can they do, you said meditate, meditate, meditate. And so Kyla is asking, what form of meditation do you practice that works best for you?
Oh, wow. It's I've never been a very good follower of anybody until I met Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk whose teaching is about mindfulness. And my meditation practice is pretty much born out of my experience with Thich Nhat Hanh. I have a regular practice, which amounts to some exercise, really body stuff first, stretch and get used to the fact that it's daytime again or whatever. I do this in the morning, and then I sit in Padmasana for as long as it takes to go through a number of repetitions of some little mantras that Thich Nhat Hanh suggested. He is one of the most prolific purveyors of good sense I know of, and he's still doing it, and he's well into his 90s. And he had a debilitating stroke, and he's still doing it, still producing these absolutely wonderful little pieces of wisdom that you can think of as a mantra. So I go through all my chakras, thinking about, while breathing in a rhythm. I do, I'm going on at great length because it doesn't have a name. So I say first, breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile. That's one of the mantras. And that's so easy to do that it doesn't confuse the mind. It doesn't, it takes away the monkey mind's activity to some degree. It's enough to keep me from rattling on, but it's not so much that it distracts from the actual breathing and the meditation, I guess. So I move up the spine with that, and then I do a second one and a third one, and there are 5 of them that I do on a regular basis. And then by that time, I'm almost ready to meditate in the sense of not doing anything, not thinking about anything, and not talking or saying a mantra and nothing. And when I'm good, I'm okay, but when I'm bad, I'm better. I think, quoting a wonderful actress from 1,000 years ago. In any case, it's basically a matter of slowing down, doing the best I can to myself, get out of the way, and just allow the presence of the universe to be, to be the connection that I have. I hope that's a little bit helpful.
Have you yourself been a subject in the random event generator studies when you were working with individuals? Did you find, for example, that being in a meditative state is helpful?
I was a subject. All the people who worked at the Pear Lab took a shot at the random event generators, especially, and all the other experiments. I was busy developing a variety of other things, like the pendulum. The one I loved most, I think, is an enormous noisy machine, which is formally called the random mechanical cascade, but which is properly known as Murphy, which comes from the fact that it was a complicated machine. And so anything that could go wrong did go wrong. That's Murphy's law. And anyway, I didn't do a whole lot of formal attempts. There was no formal experiment that I participated in that had to do with meditation, but I'll tell you, this is the most relevant kind of thing that I can say about my own personal experience. We developed a protocol for doing remote random number generator experiments that amounted to a person far away deciding the order of the intentions that would be registered for the random event generator experiment. And then later, telling those, the order, telling that information to the people at the lab, and then comparing the actual results to the intention. So while I was at a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, I had arranged to do a series of these trials. And the way it worked out is that I decided to do these things at the beginning of what were called the Dharma talks. That's when Thich Nhat Hanh came in to the 600-person congregation and gave a Dharma talk. So at the beginning of those Dharma talks, I would think of and decide upon my order of events, and then I completely forgot about it and paid attention. I listened to Thich Nhat Hanh. When I got home, I discovered that the matchup of my intentions with the trends and deviations in the database were not 100%, but damn close to it. It was the only time really I can recall ever doing well with the REG. I don't have a spectacular signature of success with those experiments. I love doing it, but that's the only time I had a really profoundly impressive effect.
I think that's a very interesting example, Roger, because it suggests if you turn the process over to the subconscious mind, don't try to do it consciously at the ego level, you'll get better results.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And
hold on, I have a problem here. What has happened?
I unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. It was my fault.
Okay, this is so much fun that I don't mind your fault. But I did forget what I was talking about.
We were talking about turning over the process to the subconscious mind, not trying to influence the random event generators at the ego trying level.
Yeah, that's right. It's so clear. And we talked to people. We didn't do formal psychological tests. We talked to people who did the experiments, and they very frequently would say something like, "Well, I can only do it if I fall in love with the machine. If I become one with the machine, and it's like my brother, my sister, my lover, then I have some chance of making the connection." But I wanted to go back to something I said about the Global Consciousness Project. The data there didn't decline, and I rather suspect that the reason for that, and this, by the way, I would think might be an argument against the experimenter effect notion. I think what happens in that, to make the data in the Global Consciousness Project is entirely unconscious, subconscious at best. But nobody knows, nobody except for me and half a dozen other people, that there is going to be any kind of a test. So nobody has any cross to bear or any standard to meet. So everybody is just doing their normal thing, and only at some subconscious level are they connected with other people and able thereby to participate in something like a global consciousness, which has some effect on the system. And I don't want to take too much time, but I want to mention that there is another protocol where there's no decline effect to speak of, and that's the remote viewing, or what we call remote perception in the Princeton lab. From beginning to end, we had pretty much the same effect size, except when we imposed more strictures on the analytical process. When we, in effect, made people more analytical and intellectual about it, then the effects would decline.
Well, we've got just about 5 minutes left, Roger. And here's an interesting question from two of our volunteers who are in France, Audic and Risk, who ask you, what are your thoughts about Teilhard de Chardin's proposal about the proto-consciousness of elementary particles?
Oh my goodness, that's I wish I knew more. I've never been able to quite get my head around proto anything. Proto consciousness sounds like a preliminary, an early form, a fundamental basic form, but I may be wrong in believing that. So My thoughts about Teilhar's proposal, I'm afraid I don't know his proposal, and so I can't really say much about it. Except that I believe Teilhar was pretty much convinced that consciousness is a kind of, not just a manifestation, but kind of a presentation of the universe in which it comes to exist.
I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions. And here's one from C. Posalipo, who asks if you could speculate on the synchronous global meditation. And I imagine over the life of your project, there have been various groups endeavoring to have global meditations to see if they affect the network.
Yes, we have looked at quite a number of them. They're often billed as something like, well, a long time ago, there was one that was billed as, I think it was the billion man meditation, but there weren't a billion people involved, but it was a large number. And as the network, the web has grown and social communication networks have grown, then I think the numbers of people involved in some of these meditations is really very large. And we have one of my colleagues, Brian Williams, did an analysis where he went through the database and pulled out everything that he thought belonged in a category of harmonious or global harmony type events. He found a little bit over 100 such events. And when he added them all up, they produced a very strong positive outcome with probability on the order of, 1 part in 10,000 or something like that it would be a chance result. So I don't have any a way of actually quantifying the numbers of people, but I do believe that if a really large number, if the number of people is larger who are engaged by an event, actually we do have evidence that this is true. The larger the N, the larger the number of people involved, according to the best estimates we can make, the larger the effect will be. Now that looks at all events. It isn't only about meditation, but I think it would probably be true for meditation events as well.
Well, Roger, our time is just about out. I want to thank all of the viewers who are with us. I think we've had a lot of really good questions, as we typically do. I'd also like to thank you for being so generous with your time, and you've done incredible pioneering work opening up the whole question of global consciousness, and it's wonderful that you're able to help hand off the system to other people who will develop the Global Consciousness Project 2.0. It's very exciting. I also want to mention to those viewers who are with us now that we have a free weekly newsletter that you can subscribe to by logging on to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation, which is New Thinking Aloud, all one word, ALLOWED is the Aloud part of it, .org. You can subscribe to our newsletter for free there. You can also check out our searchable database so that you can put in any search term and it will take you to any spot in all of our interviews, as well as videos produced by other organizations that we're including in the database. It will take you right to those places in the database. So, Roger, once again, thank you so much for being with me. And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us as well.
I want to take a minute to say, Jeff, thank you very much. And to the audience out there for the good questions. I think that New Thinking Aloud is an absolutely fabulous endeavor. And I congratulate you on that. I'm very grateful to be able to be a part of it.
It's been a real pleasure, and of course, this video will be part of the permanent archive. As soon as I end the live stream, which will be in a moment, it will go online. And there we go. I just ended it. So.
All right.